Thank you for joining us today. So I have with me FCC Commissioner Carr, who joined the FCC in 2012. I'm getting feedback on that. Is that okay? As the general counsel, and then was brought in as a commissioner last August. Mm-hmm. You were nominated and confirmed, so happy to have you. It's hopefully been a good year.
Yeah, it's been great.
So one of the things I was curious about is, when did the commission start thinking about 5G? Like, when did you guys start planning for this?
Yeah, it's been on our radar for a number of years. The technologists and the entrepreneurs have been thinking about it long before we have at the commission. But for a number of years now, we've had proceedings, whether it's the spectrum front or the infrastructure front, to do our part to help the U.S. get 5G across the finish line.
You had a recent announcement about some changes that are trying to help the regional areas and locals. Can you kind of walk us through those three major points?
Yeah, we're pretty excited when you step back and think about where the country is going from a technology perspective with 5G. And if you look back 10 years ago at where we were as a country, if you looked at the largest market cap companies, for instance, it was essentially big oil companies and big banks. And we've had a tremendous economic growth in this country that's driven in large part by the tech sector. And you think about the technologies that today ride on the 4G networks that didn't exist before 4G, whether it's Uber, Airbnbs, Netflix, tremendous amount of economic growth and really changing the lives of Americans because the U.S. won the race to 4G. And it's estimated winning that race meant about $165 billion that flowed to U.S.-based tech companies that if we'd lost that race, otherwise would have gone to other countries. And that's sort of what we face when we look at 5G. It's hard to say, just like it would have been hard to say 10 years ago that Uber's coming and Netflix is coming. That's what we look at for 5G, but it's going to be on an even greater scale than before. So the challenge we have is, how do we make sure that the U.S., from a regulatory perspective, is ready for that? Because the stakes are high. It's going to be about economic dominance for the next 10 years. The country, the region that gets 5G ready is going to enable that entirely new wave of innovation to take place. And I think it's going to take place here over the private sector's 5G networks in America, but we have work to do to get there.
You recently were in Indianapolis, which is one city that's been lucky to be deemed a hub by some of the major carriers. Why is this important to them? What's going on that this will help people of Indianapolis, and give us an example of why it's great to have 5G enablement there?
Yeah, I've been lucky in my year on the commission to spend a lot of time outside of D.C., and I've learned a lot from the time on the road. I've been to, I think, 20 states this week that we visited in the last year. And Indianapolis is a great example. We were there 3 or 4 months ago, and we heard about the state-level small cell bill that they passed in Indiana. And as a result of that decision of essentially updating our infrastructure policies to support small cells, which are going to be the building blocks of 5G, they've seen and unlocked a tremendous amount of investment and innovation in Indy. 2 carriers have already announced that Indy is going to be their showcase city for 5G. And that's because of these forward-looking policies that local and state lawmakers in Indiana put in place. So we went back there because we learned a lot from those state policies. We want to build on those state policies. Because to your other question, we've heard from a tremendous number of smaller and rural communities that they want their fair shot at 5G. They want a fair shot at 4G. And they've been asking the FCC to take action because, in their words, they're afraid that the high regulatory costs of building out 4G or 5G in some big must-serve cities is sucking up the capital, in their views, that could be used to deploy 4G and 5G in their communities. And that's what we saw in Indiana. That's why we went back there, is when you put some common sense guardrails in place to promote small cell deployment, big city and small city alike can benefit. And we want to replicate what they've done in Indiana and, frankly, in 19 other states that have state-level small cell bills. And we're taking their ideas and we're going to be voting on them at the end of this month at the FCC, so that every single community in the country is going to get a fair shot at next-gen connectivity.
Can you outline those for us?
Yeah, we're taking a couple basic ideas that have built off of these state-level bills. One is fees. There's no question that states and localities should not bear the burden or the costs associated with this build-out of 5G. At the same time, we've seen from our record and seen from the state and local actions to date that small cells in particular are sensitive to excessive fees. And if you're in a jurisdiction that has really high fees, that is limiting the deployment and impacting the deployment, including in the surrounding communities. So we make clear that cities aren't going to get to have to cover the cost of small cell deployment, but at the same time, they're limited to recovering a reasonable approximation of their cost. And that's going to put us on a path to getting more 5G out there. Second, we put some basic shot clocks in place. We've long had shot clocks that essentially govern how long a state or local government can take to review an application. And we simply update those shot clocks based on the fact that we're looking at small cells. And we take some similar actions just to create the right type of playing field. At the end of the day, there's going to be a lot of discussions and back and forth with providers and municipalities about deploying. Municipalities have always had an important and long-standing role when it comes to this. It's simply about how do we orient those discussions around some ideas that our state and local partners have already identified as really putting us on the path to 5G. So we're excited about it. It's expected to cut about $2 billion in the regulatory costs associated with small cell build-out. And that's supposed to incentivize more than that, $2.4 billion in new investment as a result of that. And that's 97% of that new investment is going to be in rural and suburban communities. So these things that we talk about in DC, they really make a difference to flip the business case for whether a small cell 4G, 5G is going to go into a community or not. And I think stepping back again, we really have to think about where we are as a country in this global competition to 4G. We talked about what winning the race to 4G meant. And we have to understand the challenge ahead of us to winning the race to 5G. This is a top priority for countries around the world, including China. If you look back at 2015, China has deployed 350,000 cell sites since 2015. The US has done less than 30,000 over that same period of time. China is deploying 460 cell sites a day. That's 12 times faster than the US is deploying. They have about 1.9 million cell sites in the country. We have somewhere between 200,000 and 300,000. So there's a gap. And the reason why China is deploying 460 cell sites a day is not because we simply need to throw more spectrum at the problem. We need more spectrum. And in fact, the US has put more spectrum allocated than any other country in the world. But this is a real, serious infrastructure problem. And we need a concrete plan to help close this gap with China. That's going to be one of the keys to winning this race to 5G, which again is all about economic dominance for the next decade. We did a decision in March at the FCC that cut about $1.5 billion from the cost of deploying the infrastructure needed for 5G. One provider has already reported that that decision is letting them clear small cells for construction at 6 times the pace as before that decision. So stepping back to the broadest level, that's the challenge that we have as an infrastructure one. And the solution is to make sure that at the federal level, at the state and local level, we all are oriented around facilitating the deployment of these small cells while ensuring that costs are recouped and that there's a reasonable timeline for state and locals to act. And I didn't mention earlier, obviously reasonable aesthetic considerations, because if an unsightly small cell goes up, it's the mayors and the council members of the local community that are going to get the phone call, or they're going to get pulled aside at the post office. It won't be us. So we've made clear that we can do this. We can win the race to 5G, and we can make sure that there's reasonable aesthetic considerations. And I've actually been surprised at the level of support we've seen for these proposals already. There's been several dozen mayors, local officials, county officials that have all spoken up and urged the FCC to take this type of action because they know it's important for the economic vitality of their community.
You were in Gilbert, Arizona on Friday. What got them ahead of the game? They just saw that there was opportunity there and they took it and they're just clearing the path?
I think that's right. So Mayor Jen Daniels, we did an event with her on Friday in Gilbert, and she's a real forward-looking leader. She was the first government official in the state of Arizona to update the Gilbert ordinance, small cell approach to small cells, to account for this new dynamic in small cell deployments. And that's going to put Gilbert at the forefront in this leading edge of new deployments. And there's communities around the country that are similarly situated, that are ready to say, look, we get it. We need more wireless infrastructure. We need more small cells. And they're working to update their regulations to do it. She was one of the first to do it. So we're building on some of her ideas.
I'm from the great state, flyover state of Nebraska. I'm sorry that my hometown of Lincoln, Nebraska is having some issues. I'm going to work on them with that. But I keep seeing pictures of you with cows. What do the cows have to do with small cells?
It's a good question. So I've been in Lincoln and actually had a very good meeting with some of the city and state officials that are trying to work through these challenging siting issues. We have had a chance to visit with a number of cows during our year on the commission, mainly connected cows. And in, I believe it was Fremont, Nebraska, or a community just outside of that, where we went to
a big slaughterhouse, or they've got a big cattle operation there, yeah.
Yeah, we went to a cattle operation there. We won't say slaughter in case there's any cows
listening. If you like steak, it came from the Midwest, so yeah.
And there's this new technology which was essentially Fitbit for cattle. So they would insert an IoT device on the tag of the cattle, and they could monitor in a really detailed way the health of the cattle. So if there was one that was having an issue, they could pull it aside and take it to the cattle vet or the glue factory, depending on how serious the issue was. And it was really saving money in terms of early identifying issues in a herd and making sure that that individual cow was taken care of, but also that the health of the herd was. So it's one small example, one tangible example of some of the technology that small cells are going to help to enable.
So taking those same ideas, can we port those to humans on telemedicine? So we can, the cow hopefully gets treated better, but now what about, Apple just came out with their new watch that's going to have all this data. I keep waiting for all that data. People running around Fitbits, I don't see people getting a lot thinner. But just the idea that you have more information, and especially in rural areas where I don't want to be tethered to a place where I only have to be X amount of yards or miles from a hospital. Is this going to help in that space as well?
Yeah, when I think about 5G, I think about a number of sort of buckets of issues. One bucket I think about is purely competition for your broadband dollars. We are going to be able to hopefully see increased competition, and some of the first 5G deployments that you're seeing are deployments directed at competing for your broadband dollars. The next bucket, I think, to your point, is interesting new applications. And telehealth, telemedicine applications is one that we're really interested in. The technology is now there, whether it's health trackers, whether it's Bluetooth-enabled blood glucose monitors. The Internet of Things can make a big difference there. And that's why 5G is important. Right now, 4G can support something in the order of 2,000 devices per square kilometer. And I have no idea what a kilometer is. I'm used to dealing in miles, but I assume it's somewhere around there. Over that same period, that same geographic area, 5G can support something like 1 million or 2 million devices. So when you think about Internet of Things and interesting new telehealth applications, that's one area that we're excited about as well.
I think the machine-to-machine application is probably the biggest gain that I see in the 5G space, is that we have all these things that can be somewhat connected, but now they're going to be extremely connected. And so that's very exciting. Talk a little bit about the spectrum that we're going to need to make this happen.
Yeah, infrastructure is a key piece of it, and you're exactly right. Spectrum goes hand in hand with that. And the U.S. has been moving forward very aggressively on that. We are about 4 gigahertz ahead of second-place China when it comes to freeing up more spectrum. One area in particular that we're focused on right now is what we call mid-band spectrum. The FCC for a number of years has been focused on the very high-band spectrum, and that's been great. We have tremendous leadership there. And now we're trying to fill in the gap by moving some more mid-band spectrum as well. We have a number of proceedings at the Commission that are going to be necessary, because essentially that's going to be the oxygen that these small cells are using to connect more devices.
We'll have harmonization challenges as well. I know we have plenty pot this year, but the idea that globally this is a challenge for everybody that we're working through.
That's right. The U.S. has long played a role in trying to make sure that the standards that are set make sense in terms of an economy of scale, and make sense for US-based companies. And we continue to exert our leadership in a number of international bodies to make sure that spectrum harmonization and standard setting works for US-based companies.
Fantastic. I'm going to open it questions from the audience. I realize I jumped in with assuming that everybody here knows what 5G is, which is the next generation that we're going through. So I'm just noting that. You're all experts now. Everybody's got this. Awesome. So I guess another question for you would be, how are we managing, you talk about China, I think their advantage is, a lot of it, the infrastructure is probably supported by the Chinese government. So Financial Times says $10 to $20 billion they're spending on their own infrastructure, and you had law of large numbers. You mentioned a large number of small cells that they already have out. We have to do this from a different perspective in that we have to go to the market economy to raise the capital, and then I think that's where I see the work that you're doing to make sure that the fee structure stays limited, allows, if you only have $1,000 for every siting, that if 500 of that goes to the city, there's less cell sites that are going to go up. So are you finding that the economics of this is something that is well understood with the local and state governments, or do we need to be spending more time in that area? I worry that the Chinese are just getting to spend all the money that they don't have to account for.
Yeah, a couple of great questions in there. I think there's a lot of big cities that, from their perspective, they can both win the race to 5G in their community. They can get 5G in their community. And they can look at small cell deployment as a potential revenue-generating opportunity to deal with budget shortfalls, real issues that they're having in their communities. But when you step back at a national perspective, and again, when you look at where China is going, 460 cell sites a day, how do we ramp up and create some common sense approach that's not one size fits all? We have to have some reasonable room for discussions at the state and local level. But we can't underestimate that challenge. We need to put out somewhere in the order of 60,000 cell sites a year in this country. And we did 30,000 from 2015 to now. We've got to ramp that number up from there. So when you think about that infrastructure challenge at a national level, how can we create the process for all of those deployments to take place? Obviously, I take the U.S. all day from a regulatory perspective and a government perspective compared to China. And I think the U.S. can win this race. Our regulatory structures can be updated. Our private sector is going to come up with the money, not the government. And I think we can do it. We just need to continue down this path of freeing up spectrum and of modernizing our infrastructure rules. But we can win this race. If you look at 4G, that's the same playbook that we use to win that race. We freed up more spectrum than any country in the world, and we took specific action to make it easier for providers to update 3G with 4G antennas. That's the playbook, spectrum and infrastructure, but the challenge is this massive scale that we have to do it on. So that's why we need to take some action now.
Well, thank you for your leadership. I really appreciate it, and I thank you for being here this morning.
Thanks.
Oh, sorry. Do you have a question? Yeah. Yes. We'll go back up to questions. Sorry, you didn't have one earlier.
Oh, okay. Yeah. It took me a second. John Godfrey with Samsung. Commissioner, in your travels around the country, have you been talking to local government officials in the? Oh, thank you. John Godfrey with Samsung. Commissioner, in your travels, have you been talking with local government officials in the departments of cities and communities that would benefit from 5G? As opposed to the ones who may be in a kind of a tense relationship around streamlining. Last week at Mobile World Congress Americas, the head of the Department of Transportation in the city of Los Angeles was one of the keynote speakers, and she spoke eloquently about how 5G may help solve some of the city's traffic problems. And there's public safety departments and environmental protection departments. Have you talked with those folks about what 5G could mean for them?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think we can certainly do more of that. And my time, I've met with several dozen, whether it's all the way from governors to mayors to local officials, and talked through this. People that work in city planning departments. I was in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, went on a small cell walking tour with their city planning department. But to your point, we've also met with other portions of local government that are going to benefit. On Friday in Gilbert, Arizona, we went to one of the local firehouses and talked to the fire chief. And they were telling us their vision, what they see 5G doing in terms of improving the safety and the lives of their firefighters and otherwise addressing this public safety issue. And it was enlightening. In D.C. we talk a lot about 5G, and they were really educating us about the technology that they see coming down that's going to help the firefighters in the community. And then the transportation side as well. It's a really interesting aspect of 5G. We have something in the order of 30 to 40,000 car-related deaths a year. 5G can help play a role in bringing autonomous vehicles here safely. We can drive that number down to approaching zero. These are all some of the interesting benefits that can come if we win this race with 5G.
Question back here. Dan.
Hi, Dan Blumenthal from AEI. So on the China competition, and it's not just China, but beyond the infrastructure, the cellular infrastructure, there are obviously Chinese companies benefiting from a whole set of Chinese non-competitive policies, beyond the subsidization that seem like they're really going after the business models of our most innovative companies, trying either to buy them or to make their R&D models less expensive, not profitable. It's not just China. I mean, obviously the South Koreans had this case, which seems like now it was pure bribery and collusion using their FTC to try to keep some of our companies from competing fairly in that space. So it does seem difficult to, we're a market-based economy, competing against countries who want to win this race that are not, and it does seem like we may need other tools to push back on some government policies that are meant just to benefit national champions.
Yeah, I would say this. I believe passionately in the American free market and the American-style capitalism. And I think getting the government out of the way from an infrastructure perspective is key to unleashing that. And I have confidence that our approach is enough to win against any other system of government that's out there when it comes to 5G or other technology. To your point, though, we do have other proceedings as well ongoing. The administration, whether they have some, at the FCC, we have a supply chain proceeding right now where we're looking at, are there cyber and security threats that we need to be taking different actions on? And we're developing a robust record there, and if appropriate, we can step in and take action in that proceeding as well. So we're focused, to your point, on a number of different actions, but I really think the key is going to be to essentially get the government out of the way. And then with our free market approach, we're going to be right there, and U.S.-based companies are going to thrive on the private sector's 5G network when we get it built out in this country.
I thought we were fortunate that the Olympics took place when this was going on because South Korea is known for being exceptionally quick adopters. So anything that would take us maybe 3 or 6 months to figure out, they do in 10 days there. So you get a really quick turnaround, so we got the benefit from that. But what I think I hear you saying is that they don't have the innovative thought process. We probably wouldn't be talking about the Korean cows. There's just a lot of things that people can look at this from a very raw data perspective and say, okay, I can find ways to adapt that and make that more efficient with the low latency and the high speeds of what we're going into. So as much as I see the point about the race, I think that Americans' innovation is always going to win in that space. That's my point of view on that. Other questions? Over here.
Maggie Moore from the House Small Business Committee. What challenges do you see, what potential challenges, but also benefits do you see for simultaneously deploying 5G while also continuing efforts to rural broadband deployment?
It's a good question. I view all of this really together. When we were in Arizona, for instance, the regulatory cost for putting up one small cell was $4,000 per small cell before the state enacted its small cell bill. Representative Wenninger, who I did an event with on Friday, was one of the lead authors of that bill. That cost has now gone from $4,000 to $50. Think about the number of communities that fall between 50 and 4,000 in terms of either the amount of capital that a company needs to deploy to Arizona. It's going to go that much farther, and that's going to push into rural communities. Because that's the real key. I don't think winning the race to 5G is the first time we see a deployment in New York or the first time we see it in San Francisco. To me, we need to make sure every community has a fair shot, and we can go a long way in terms of flipping the business case by cutting excess regulatory costs out of the system. There's other steps we need to take. We obviously have a $10 billion a year universal service fund that's designed to support rural deployments. But I'm confident that these regulatory changes we're looking at are going to make a big difference in communities outside of large metro centers.
One last question. There? Mike, right there. Thank you.
Our former FCC chief economist, Thomas Hazlitt, in his recent book, talks about the FCC effort to, in the spectrum allocation, to make it more market-oriented. Do you expect that effort to continue, and do you think that will speed the 5G rollout?
I think so. It's a good question. Take the C-band, for instance. The C-band is spectrum that traditionally was used by satellite entities and is also used on the cable side for certain types of services and technologies. We've put a number of ideas on the table to try to free up some of that C-band spectrum for the private sector to use for 5G-style deployments. One of the ideas we put on the table within that mix is an idea that would rely on market forces as opposed to the government either taking spectrum back and re-auctioning it or otherwise being interventionist from a government perspective. We've laid out some ideas that would allow the private sector to do negotiations, and then we could step in from a regulatory perspective to do the licensing actions that would be needed. And I think that is potentially the fastest path to reorienting that spectrum as opposed to more interventionist government approaches. And more generally, I do think that our market-based approach to spectrum is one that's been tremendously successful, and we need to keep leaning on that in the years to come.
Thank you, Commissioner Carr, for your time this morning. We really appreciate it.
Thanks. Appreciate it.
Thanks. All right, we are going to set up for a panel, so just give us a couple minutes if anybody wants to grab a cup of coffee, and we will be back on stage here in 2 minutes. All right, can I get my panelists to join us up here now that we're reset?
Okay. Can't wait to see that thing, John.
Thank you all. So I am joined here on stage with Sam Love, who is legislative assistant for Senator Cory Gardner, and he has been a key architect of the Airwaves Act, which we'll be getting into in just a minute. Roger Entner, who is the president of Recon Analytics and has done a lot of writing in this area and has several studies that are on his website, but specifically one that I know that CTIA uses quite often. We have Hank Holquist, who is Vice President for Federal Regulatory Affairs at AT&T and is a Spectrum and 5G expert. and John Godfrey, who is Senior Vice President in Public Policy from Samsung, who brought us a prop, who he's going to show us in just a minute. So for all of you wondering what a small cell actually looks like, we have one with us. So Sam, let's start with you. You have really done a comprehensive job of looking at the landscape that you have encompassed in your legislation. Can you just kind of walk us through what you've got in there so far?
Sure, yeah. So Senator Gardner and Senator Hassan have introduced what's called the Airwaves Act, which is a bill that would primarily do two things. One is it would set up a series of spectrum auctions over the next few years, try to get more spectrum into the pipeline and hit half of that sort of 5G puzzle that Commissioner Carr was just talking about in terms of infrastructure and spectrum. Senator Gardner is particularly interested in the economic benefits that we can reap from winning the race to 5G, not just 5G itself, but some of those secondary services like Uber, other technologies that have been developed over the infrastructure that was put in place by 4G. So that's really important from that perspective. So on the one hand, it creates this pipeline of spectrum auctions over the next few years with an aggressive timeline. On the second part of it is, in this race to 5G, we can't forget about rural areas of the country. I'm from rural Colorado. My boss is from rural Colorado. He's fond of saying he can get to 5 bars in his hometown, just not on his phone. So it's really critical that we don't forget and leave behind these rural areas as we are working to win this race to 5G. So what the bill would do is it would reserve 10% of the proceeds of the spectrum auctions that are contemplated in the bill for build out in rural areas. What that would mean in real dollar terms is, looking just at the last 2 spectrum auctions alone, that's anywhere from $6 to $7 billion in additional build-out money that could be provided for rural areas. So it's sort of a two-pronged approach, one, to alleviate the spectrum crunch and help win the race to 5G with those auctions, and then 2, not leaving behind rural areas in the country and providing that 10% allocation.
You've also talked about the urban crunch. What is that?
Yeah, so I think that, we see places like Denver, for example. Denver's one of the larger metropolitan areas in the country, but we actually have among the worst wireless service of any of the major metropolitan areas, in part because we're seeing a huge number, 100,000 people per year that we're having come to Colorado annually, and really putting a strain on some of the telecommunications infrastructure that we have in the area. And so as we've seen the advent of video, as we've seen population increases in areas like Denver, it's more important than ever that we're providing opportunities for access to more spectrum to alleviate the sort of the crunch or the traffic that we're seeing on the airwaves.
And then what's your idea on the proceeds from the auctions?
So the idea is it would not be tied to the existing Universal Service Fund. This would be a new sort of fund that would be created out of the proceeds, the 10% allocation, rural allocation. The idea is that we've seen time and again in rural America, as the rest of the country is moving ahead to 4G, to LTE, these other services, rural America is frequently being left behind. In my own hometown, we still have 3G service. Same for the senator. We're not seeing LTE deployed everywhere. Folks are working to get that out as quickly as they can, and we appreciate that. We just want to make sure that rural America is being taken care of as well. So if you look at the Senate Commerce Committee, there are a lot of members from rural states on the Senate Commerce Committee, and they have a strong interest in making sure that all their constituents are served. And so we want to be partners in winning the race to 5G, and we think it's critically important both from an economic and national security perspective. But we think that making sure that rural America is provided for is important as well.
Fantastic. Roger, can we talk a little bit? We've talked about some of the macro theoretical areas. What's actually going on in the industry with us moving to cloud to mobile and how we're actually going to be able to get all this cool stuff on these little devices?
Yeah, so, a lot of when we talk about the innovations that come with 5G, they're still very nebulous. One of the things that are very tangible is what's called edge computing. So there are, as Commissioner Carr said, there are roughly 300,000 cell sites. At every cell site, there is this refrigerator-sized box at the bottom where currently a base station is in, which basically controls your calls and your data sessions. That is turning into software and moving into a big data center and leaves behind an empty box. So what carriers are now thinking about is filling that box with a small data center, where you have computing, where you have storage, and the like. what does that let you do? What that lets you do, because with 5G you have basically zero latency, so it takes basically no time to reach that. It lets you move the power envelope, which means computing power, battery power, and the heat that comes with it, from your device into that base station, and suddenly gives you a lot more power, computing power and everything, into a device that becomes a lot smaller. So right now, for example, if you do AR or VR, you have like a pound or two hanging on your nose, right? That's not really a very good user experience, because you get a stiff neck. And nobody wants to carry these things around for more than 15, 20 minutes. Now, the moment you're moving all of that battery, power, heat away from your nose and your eyes into something that's maybe a mile away, it becomes a lot more user-friendly. And it opens up so many other things. By moving computing power close to people, you also have the potential to changing the whole makeup of the internet and where computing power is. Right now, your pictures on your Google device or your Apple device, there's somewhere in 10 or 12 data centers or 20 data centers, depending on the company, somewhere in the United States. They can move very close to where you are. So that becomes much faster. Because if you think about it, every 300 miles the data center is away, it's one additional millisecond of latency. And that's simply because of the speed of light, because the light travels 300 miles a millisecond. So by moving it closer, it becomes faster and faster and faster. This also allows you to distribute data. So, for example, we all know, unfortunately, about these data heists, where you name the company, we all remember them, but don't have to repeat them. Somebody broke into that data center and stole hundreds of thousands of credit card numbers. When suddenly every store, it gets distributed out and only aggregated when necessary, it doesn't become a data heist, it becomes a data pickpocket. And the headline then says 250 or 2,500 credit card numbers are stolen instead of 2.5 million. So it helps you speed up things. It helps you revolutionize end-user equipment because you can make things a lot more powerful without making them more cumbersome and harder to use. And it enhances security. And it has the potential to change how the internet is actually computed. So that's one of the things that 5G makes a reality of.
Great. Hank, you're representing one of the companies we're expecting to do a lot of work. So all of this that's been discussed, and then we also have, as Roger kind of talks about the moving to the edge, the network virtualization, the software-defined networking. There's a lot that's going on in this process. How is that going over at AT&T, as well as arguing and discussing how much you should be spending on small cells and where they should be going?
Thanks, Shane. So I think Roger's point is actually quite profound. And it's hard to, in some ways, picture how by moving where things happen and how they are performed, you actually will change the nature of the internet. It's hard to picture, but I think it's quite profound and true. And just to throw one more example out there, when you put the processing and battery and these other capabilities into these edge locations, now you can have not just, devices that are lighter and smaller. You can have different kinds of devices. It becomes feasible for nodes to be out there that require very little battery power because they're not performing the processing and the memory and all that other stuff. And so because their functions are more limited, they can have batteries that last much longer than existing devices that you might try to deploy. So I think it's easy to underestimate how profound that change will be. A lot of 5G, when people think about 5G, they think about, well, the changes that we're making in antenna technologies, the changes that we're making in introducing a new radio waveform, the changes that we're making to support really the radio part of the network. But I think one of the things that's most important with 5G is the way the radio part of the network will work hand in hand with the core. And this gets to your point about, AT&T has been a leader for several years now in moving away from what I would describe as a traditional network approach to networking, where you have a box that's sold to do one thing. So it provides one service, one kind of service. And if you want to introduce a new capability into the network, you have to go out and procure new boxes and put those boxes into the network, and they control the second service. What software-defined networking and network function virtualization will do, what they do is they enable you to deploy generic equipment in the network that you can introduce new services on simply by updating the software of the equipment. They call these things white boxes. This will be, a true accelerator for 5G, because one of the capabilities of 5G is what I would describe as a much more sophisticated ability to apportion the radio service, and they call this network slicing. It really lets you create multiple virtual networks within your radio network. And some of those you will want to be performing traditional consumer services. Others you will want to be performing industrial Internet of Things services. And the ability to marry that capability in the radio network with the virtualization of functions in the core will really create an opportunity to quickly introduce new services and have innovation take place at a much faster rate than was possible with dedicated networking equipment.
I would imagine, especially in the industrial area, the machines being able to talk back and forth with each other, with being knowledgeable, thanks to IoT capability and things that are coming on, it'll eliminate a lot of the human latency, actually, of where you had to transfer information back and forth. Okay, it's time for show and tell. Do you have the box?
I do, yeah, Shane. Before I jump to that, I do want to say Samsung's really excited that last week AT&T announced that we would be one of their suppliers of 5G network equipment, as well as your only supplier, at least so far, of CBRS equipment. And that goes along with Samsung's selection by Verizon and Sprint in the 5G area.
Can you tell us what CBRS is?
CBRS is the Citizens Broadband Radio Service the FCC has allocated, and it's a lightly licensed, innovation-friendly piece of spectrum at 3.5 gigahertz. And initial deployments will probably be LTE-based, but will transition to 5G over time. So I want to talk briefly about refrigerators. Some of you in the room may know why refrigerators are important, and Roger actually alluded to it. There is a rumor going around that 5G small cells will have not just an antenna, but also a component as big as a refrigerator. And that is just not true. And I know a little bit about refrigerators because Samsung is the #1 refrigerator brand in America. And where this is coming from is the FCC's streamlining of the historic and environmental regulatory reviews earlier this year, which allowed for a streamlined process if the associated equipment is 28 cubic feet or smaller. And first of all, a refrigerator, a 28 cubic foot refrigerator, that's referring to the inside capacity. The actual refrigerator is much bigger. So the FCC's rule actually would apply to something quite a bit smaller than a refrigerator. But that's not really the important point. The important point is that the FCC was really thinking about the traditional macro cells there. The 5G small cells are largely not going to have that external component. And what I brought is the actual casing. It doesn't have the electronics in it. But this is the casing of the 28 gigahertz 5G millimeter wave access unit for Verizon, which are going live beginning October 1st of this year in Sacramento and Houston for fixed wireless access service. And this is the whole thing. You pop off this cover where the cables are. This is where the optical and the power go in. And then this is it. The top part, a little over half, has an array of 1,024 antenna elements, and those work together to form an electrically steerable beam. And that delivers over a gigabit per second of data to the customers, or it can be divided up among multiple customers. The part below that is where the baseband processing is. And that's everything. The only thing that a carrier might have in addition to this, depending on how they've deployed their network, is an AC to DC converter. And maybe there's got to be a place to plug the fiber optics into the backhaul network. But that's it. So that's all there is to it. Samsung would be happy to put a refrigerator in your kitchen, and in a couple of years, it may be a 5G refrigerator, but there are not going to be refrigerators on your streetlights.
So I understand that actually gray was a chosen color too, that they actually they market tested that with the locals, and that seems to make people happy because it's unobtrusive.
They kind of blend in. At the Mobile World Congress Americas show last week, there were lots and lots of base stations from Samsung and other companies, and they do all seem to be gray. And I had a lot of people coming through the booth asking questions about it. And if I can tell you one final note on that, one of the people who came through our booth last week actually asked me about this base station. Isn't there also a separate refrigerator that keeps it cool? And that shows how far a rumor can morph.
So where will
so please stop the rumor.
So let's keep going with the truth. Where is that going to be placed? So
it'll be placed on. Actually, the Wall Street Journal did a really nice 5G section last Thursday, and there were some pictures in there of what the deployments will look like. And so this unit would go maybe on top of a street light sticking up at the top of the pole part, so you wouldn't even notice that there's something new there, or maybe clustered around the side of the pole or on the corner of a building. Now also where there are existing giant cell towers, you could imagine that AT&T or others might put some of them on the cell tower, but you don't have to go build a 200-foot cell tower for this.
So I know line of sight's important. How does that work with that box?
Oh, well, we're really geeking out here, Shane. That's great. The antenna arrays create this steerable beam, which helps concentrate the energy, and that overcomes the limitation of those very, very high frequencies where they don't propagate as far as lower frequencies do. And they also don't really penetrate buildings. So they're the beams get pointed at the user. And so if it's like for a fixed wireless access deployment like what Verizon is launching this year, this unit will be on a pole. There will be a router at the customer's house, in their window, or on the outside of their house, and the beam goes between them. But one thing that's really interesting is you can also bounce the beams off of buildings and around corners. Or if something blocks the direct line of sight, then the equipment will adapt and find a beam that bounces that will connect them. So you actually won't need these to be every block. The range that our trials indicate works in an urban environment is about 2,000 feet.
So this is a question to the group. What can I do with the gig that is coming my direction that I can't do with the 400 megabytes? I always get that. Then what I currently have. I know that I've got some industrial machine to machine. It sounds like the machines are getting smarter. But what do I have to look forward to? What's going to enhance my life?
Well, one of the things that why you need more bandwidth is right now, I think the average home connection has 28 devices hanging on it, and every one of them is using capacity. So, and as Commissioner Carr said earlier, the number of devices that we will use is going up and up and up, and therefore we need more capacity. It's not that one of the connections will use dramatically more speed. a 4K video, for example, uses 25 megabits. But if you're a family and there are 4 of you, and as modern families are these days, each watches their individual program, then you have 100 megabits alone from that, and you have a connection for this and that. And so you want to have more and more capacity because we have more and more concurrent connections.
Shane, I think the answer to your question really is that we don't know what it'll be, but it'll be awesome. And that was actually the answer 10 years ago when people were asking, what's 4G going to be for? Because I remember when people were saying, why do we really need 4G? We don't need to open our email that much faster. We can look at the mobile optimized version of websites just fine. Do you remember those? We don't really need those anymore since 4G came along, the mobile optimized. But the thing that really came out of America winning the race to deploy 4G is all the applications and services that were invented on top of that. And I would say, I don't think social networking would be a thing if it weren't for 4G. Because if to connect with your social network on Facebook or Instagram or Snapchat, you had to be sitting at your desktop computer, I don't think people would do it as much. But since it's with them all the time on their phone, social networking really took off. Ride sharing would not be possible without 4G. And I don't think the carriers were talking about ride sharing when they were justifying the investment in 4G. 5G is going to enable, I think Roger is exactly right, cloud computing, enabling the computing to connect to you in real time wherever you are, along with artificial intelligence, is going to unlock some changes in our way of doing business and in our lifestyle that we can sort of speculate now what they are going to be. What's going to happen is innovative companies in the United States or South Korea or other parts of the world are going to invent some new services that are going to catch on because 5G exists.
Actually, I just remembered, have you heard of volumetric video?
I'm sorry, what?
Volumetric video.
I have not.
So Intel developed something called volumetric video. And if you search it on the internet, you will find several demos of it. So for example, right now, how many cameras are at an NFL game? Somewhere around 15 or so?
It's a whole new experience. Yeah, it's amazing.
But with volumetric video, it's going to be several hundred. And then you get the whole 3D experience, and you can put the point of view of the viewer anywhere on the playing field, and you can like watch the game from the perspective of your favorite linebacker or wide receiver or quarterback. As it happens, you can have movies where you can look at the actor from all different angles and watch the dialogue or the action scene from what the director wants to be or what you want it to be as the director. And the amount of data that's going to be needed to make that a seamless experience is tremendous.
Let's go back to international competitiveness. I know we keep hearing this phrase, the race to 5G. Are we really racing each other? Are we concerned we're going to lose? And what does that mean?
Well,
I was going to say from Senator Gardner's perspective, from what we see in Congress, this is both an economic issue, talking about the secondary services that folks up here on the panel have been talking about, some of these innovations that no one had envisioned at the time that 4G was being developed. We'd be missing out on many of these secondary service innovations, a lot of the research and development that goes on surrounding these things, and that's a major economic issue, but it's also a national security issue. And I think that we've seen Chinese telecommunications providers like Huawei, for example, who are being very aggressive about trying to sign agreements in countries that we are allied with to try to build out these kinds of services. So at some level, it's also a national security perspective. And so I think, if we're looking on the economic side of things at the secondary services, it's not necessarily going to be, in the very short term, if there's someone who's first or second, and we may not see the impacts, but over the long term, some of these economic benefits that we were able to realize with 4G are not going to be present. So,
I would add, I do think, it sounds, sometimes it sounds like it's kind of like a slogan or something, but I do think it's likely to be true that the places where 5G is early and broadly deployed will be the pioneers of the innovation of the things that take advantage of 5G. And I think that is an important consideration.
Well, I wrote a whole report about that for CTIA. And basically what happens when you lose the race for a new generation, a whole sector of your industry dies. So, for example, the United States was leading in 1G, which is the old analog phones, and we had to invest a lot of money, and the FCC required carriers to keep 1G around on their phones, whereas the European carriers were chasing ahead with 2G and GSM. What happened? Well, we had wireless infrastructure companies like Lucent, if you remember them, $140 billion IPO, described as the nobody had a better shot as an IPO, as a startup than Lucent. Nortel in Canada or Motorola had an infrastructure division. They all died. So then the Europeans, they won 2G and they flourished with a lot of infrastructure and handsets. We all remember Nokia and Ericsson and Siemens and Alcatel, all these companies dominating the space. And, today we still reminisce that Europe seems to be the promised land of wireless. That comes from those days. But those days are long gone. And the European carriers bought 3G spectrums, and then they got scared of their own investment and said, oh my God, we spent so much money on it. Let's not put too much money in building it out. We don't know if we have a payback. And Japan charged ahead. What happened in Europe? There was a headline in Forbes, a picture of Olli-Pekka Kallasvuo, the then CEO of Nokia, which had 60% of handset market share on the planet, saying, who can ever beat these guys? 3 years later, they were dead. We had Ericsson had to sell their handset division to Sony. Siemens sold it to a company called BenQ, and because it was about bankrupt, and they completely bankrupted it.
So you're saying they just didn't see the innovative edge? They were
didn't
being
see
complacent?
the innovative edge.
Got it.
They reaped the benefits and lost it. And the mantle for 3G went to Japan. Japan, if you remember, they were like the hallmark of the mobile internet with iMode. And they, at their peak, spent or gave developers $17 billion a year, just in Japan, to developers. To put that in context, Google on a global basis had never given developers $17 billion a year. Only 2 years ago, Apple has reached that benchmark on a global basis. They just did it in Japan, 120 million people.
Jonathan, you wanted to add?
They did a pretty good job, but then the US took over leadership in 4G. What happened? Well, iMode no longer exists. The whole ecosphere basically died or migrated to Android or Apple. Of their 7 handset manufacturers, 4 of them died. The iPhone has now more than 50% market share in Japan, to the point where the Japanese government gets concerned about the dominance of that. So losing leadership means a really important part of your economy dies and doesn't come back. And that's the danger
Coming on the
here.
advent of Halloween, I'm thinking that there's a mobile handset graveyard somewhere in your office that you should
Oh, I
share
do.
with
I have several
pictures of all
chests
these
full.
dead devices, John.
I guess, Roger, I agree that's a sad story, but I think you may be focusing on the wrong players here. Not only they are very important players, these companies that have gone away, and I certainly love the equipment and device part of the market. That's the part of the market that I work in. But the big economic impact of 5G, as it was in 4G, is going to be on the entirely new companies and entirely new services that will ride above the equipment level and above the device level and run on those devices.
Yes.
So, and I hope no one, and I think you would agree with this, I hope no one would conclude that the answer is protectionism, protecting domestic companies against competition. I think the answer is to get the networks built as fast as possible in the United States so that U.S. companies can innovate, and both current and new U.S. companies can innovate in competition with the rest of the world.
Oh, absolutely, because protectionism is a two-way street. Usually when you protect your market, somebody else protects the market too, their market too, and then it closes it for both, and it's a lot worse. But where it really becomes important to have these widespread networks is basically that the whole country is your test bed. If you have it only in a few cities, then developers can only be in these few cities. And that limits the number of garages, the literal garages, that new innovators can do it. Also, it limits the speed to market that your innovation can make it from idea to funding to widespread adoption. Companies like the rapid pace of the internet and mobile internet even more so really is best used when as many consumers as possible can take advantage of your services as quickly as possible. And then funding comes. Because if you go to a venture capital company and you say, oh, I might give you a payback in 10 years. Whereas, oh, the guy down the street went from idea to funding to being a unicorn, $1 billion in 3 years. Investment flow is a lot better.
So we've kind of hinted around this, but I'm going to go back to let's call it the China question. Are we concerned that Huawei in some way locks out us from competition, that we end up becoming a follower, that we stop leading? What is our concern about that? Go for it.
Well, one of the interesting things that has happened over time is these generational standards are developed by committee. And the companies in the industries, the Samsungs, the Nokias, the Ericssons, are all participating. And 2G was basically almost a European-centric thing alone. When it came to 3G, Qualcomm played a huge role in it as well as in 4G. The Japanese companies were almost nowhere to be seen. Right now, Huawei and CTE are contributing almost half of the patents to 5G. What that means is when you're part of the patent pool and you contribute a substantial number of patents, you get the other patents for free. Whereas if you didn't participate, you had to pay. So for example, Nokia already said, if you want to have a 5G patent to do phones and hardware equipment and you're not part of that pool, thank you very much, $3.50 per device. That adds up really, really quickly. So so that makes it a lot cheap, even cheaper now for Chinese companies to do 5G. Lowers their cost base even further. Also,
because they're contributing now.
Because they're contributing. You're paying one way or the other.
Okay, got it.
And they're already laying the basis for all the adjacent things that come from it. The the most supercomputers and the most powerful supercomputers in the world are not in Europe, not in the US anymore, they're in China. And combining supercomputers with 5G gives you a huge edge on artificial intelligence, which is another really transformational technology we haven't talked about, which you can't be on a panel not talk about the artificial intelligence. So we had to cross off that box. But it all is connected together. And with the very loose rules that China has with privacy, part of the reason why they have so many small cells is because they've become such a surveillance state that they are taking video of every street corner and then are running it through AI to identify you the moment you step out your door, you go wherever. They can trace you even more than Google can trace you. When you go from
Shane, there's no camera in here.
Right. That's good to know. But does the fact that they might have intellectual property now invested, does that help us in the balance? Because I know that's always been a challenge. And I'm not talking necessarily trade, it's just the respect for intellectual property.
Well, they're contributing it. But for example, they stole all of Nortel's intellectual property. That's the foundation of Huawei, basically, is what Nortel developed. And that's how it got them a head start. And we know that Chinese state security and Russian state security are very active in the appropriation of proprietary secrets of companies without compensation. So it is very concerning.
All right, let's get back to the positive side of this. So we've got we've got virtualization of network applications, faster data, lower latency with connectivity, better asset tracking and management, smart agriculture, better infrastructure, telemedicine, Internet of Things, inventory control. Am I missing anything? Sounds like we got a lot of stuff on the horizon. That's
Say agriculture.
Agriculture, cows. We got the cows. All right.
Self-driving cars.
Autonomous
Self-driving
vehicles,
cars,
yeah.
you're right, yeah. Those still kind of scare me. I think I put those in the back of my head. Because I know that until 5G is real, I probably don't want to be in a whole world of cars running around that don't have the ability to have low latency. So cars.
Healthcare.
Healthcare is
the
huge.
low-hanging fruit there is aging in home.
Yes, especially
aging
to
in place.
society. Right, aging in place.
Telepresence, being in another place and really feeling like you are there through virtual reality and augmented reality. Another one would be having the whole internet helping you as you travel through your day. You can imagine blind people walking down the street and some kind of cloud computing resource is doing image recognition on what's in front of them and telling them where they are and helping them through their day. And kind of that application would be useful for sighted people as well, but it could really empower blind people to live independently in a miraculous way.
I look forward to eventually seeing something at Samsung and be able to show that to us. I'm going to open it up to questions in the audience, right up front here. Got my mic runners getting their mics.
Good morning. I'm Tina Iotis. I'm a cybersecurity strategist. To the extent that you talked a little bit about it being a national security issue, I mean, obviously we love all the innovation that will come with this, and it may not be on point to what you do, but you have comments about the security by design and the security built into this new capability and infrastructure, and how are policies being developed so that it's not yet another example of us trying to catch up to and stop the exploitation and abuse, because I think that data flow for machine learning and artificial intelligence, the ability to manipulate that is a big one. So if you want to comment on that.
Sure. So I think that's a really important point, especially when you think about the billions of devices that will be, put out there to use the 5G networks. I think security by design is going to be very, very important. Obviously, we have seen with 4G the introduction of devices, and really just Wi-Fi maybe more than anything, the introduction of devices that did not have security by design and the problems related to that. I do think on the network side, the networks, I think, are going to continue to work hard on security from their perspective, and I think that's kind of just continuing what we're doing today. But when I think about 5G and I think about those billions of devices, that point about security by design is critical.
Samsung and AT&T are two of the founding members of a group called the Council to Secure the Digital Economy that was formed earlier this year. That's really drawing from the telecom sector, the IT sector, the consumer technology sector, and trying to lead industry consensus on security best practices and good practices in being a partner with the public sector.
Does the line of sight allow you to do geofencing a little more sufficiently, or is that just something I made up in my head?
Potentially true.
Okay, I was just wondering about that with the ability. Other questions? In the back here?
Thank you. I'm Ulrich Mans from the Netherlands Embassy. Question to AT&T and Samsung. Looking at the software and the management software that goes into these boxes, could you tell a little bit about where we are, where we have to be, what needs still to be piloted out and developed further, and how the ecosystem here in the US is developing in that regard, particularly
Hoping you can answer that question, John.
Well, that's maybe a little outside of my expertise, but I know that the engineers in the company have assured me that there is end-to-end security built into our 5G equipment, and that's both software and hardware. I know as a more general principle, I assume it's true of these. I know it's true of our phones that a hardware-rooted trust element that's really embedded at the factory level is important to enable multiple layers of security and authentication and trust so that malicious software can't be introduced to run in place of the software that's supposed to be there. So Samsung, we think, is uniquely positioned to deliver for 5G the chips, the network equipment, and the mobile devices, all from a secure and trusted supply chain.
One last question over here.
I wonder if you can take a few moments and reveal to us some of the secrets that you have in your video conferencing labs about stuff that you can roll out by virtue of this new 5G. And just to give a little background where my thought was, just a couple weeks ago, I was in Jerusalem, and they have one of the newest tourist attractions is rooms sort of like this, where maybe 50 chairs in each of the little room. Each person is sitting in their own chair. Each person has their own video glasses. It's sort of like they have this volumetric view. Mm-hmm. And so everyone sees, for the 15 minutes that they see a different video because you can swivel around in your chair. No one is seeing what you see unless you tell, everyone is able to go. And so to me, it solves the thing that video conferencing today I find just really, really hard to accept, because I can't look across the room and have the other person look at me because it doesn't know. But if we're all in these chairs and you have this capability, it seems like you could have avatars if you're in your underwear, but you can be in a conference like this and everyone could see. And if you're the salesman and you've got products you're showing, then you make sure you have the video that everyone can see. And each of us could see, or we could look around the room at other colleagues and visually the kind of thing that we would do in a normal meeting. So I'm thinking this is part of 5G kind of thinking. So maybe
I'm
you
not
can
sure
say,
he can tell you the super secret things,
yeah.
but he might be able to.
I wouldn't be able to share any secrets, but what I will point out is, like, this room here has multiple cameras. They're all on the wall. They're wired into a fiber background. They're not really using wireless. But if you wanted to really create a fully believable recreation of this room, you would want to have cameras all over the room, on the ceiling, on the tables, and rather than string fiber to all of those, use 5G for wireless connection. That's what it would enable. Samsung last year, I think it was earlier this year, we did a trial at a baseball stadium in Okinawa that was like that. We put many, many cameras around the batter and streamed, and they were all streaming wirelessly, and then the user can select and move around the batter to get a customized view. And if you do that throughout the baseball stadium, you'll get a truly personalized experience.
Someone also just did that at the U.S. Open.
Great. Last question for the panelists. What do we need to do in the next year to make 5G a reality? I'll start with you, John, and come back this way.
Pass the Airwaves Act.
Thank you. You stole mine.
Yeah, I can see where that was going to go. And also this Streamline Act is also a good one. And I think the FCC should continue its leadership in working with local jurisdictions to streamline the local deployment.
I think from a policy perspective, Commissioner Carr talked about it a little earlier. The effort to bring more mid-band spectrum into use is critically important. And then, of course, there's just the blocking and tackling of from a operations perspective of getting out there and successfully deploying all of the infrastructure that's needed, then to turn that spectrum into capacity and networks.
Great.
Yeah, what we need is more spectrum. What we need is faster deployment. So the rules and regulations that Commissioner Carr talked about that he wants to streamline helps greatly. But we should also go win the hearts and minds of the local municipalities, that it's in their own best interest to do that, and not just because somebody in Washington said you have to do this in X many days, but really help these municipalities how it is in their own best interest and that of their citizens that this comes as quickly as possible.
Just to echo everything that they said, Airwaves Act obviously is a major priority for us. And, in terms of winning the hearts and minds, Colorado is among the few states that has gone out and passed streamlining legislation at the state level. So would continue to encourage that kind of thing as well.
Yeah. 1 of 9 states.
1 of 9. Well, thank you very much to the panelists. Please join me in thanking our panelists for today's discussion.